Well, then let me start with introducing myself and Lynn. I'm Carla Haelermans indeed, and Lynn van Vugt, my colleague, will do this presentation together. And let me start secondly by saying that we did, sorry Tom, in the meantime, change the title a bit. It's just the title, not the content or what it is about. But what we are going to talk about, or what we named the paper now, is a full year of COVID-19 crisis, the effects of learning gains and inequality in Dutch primary education. And indeed, this full year crisis does include the 2 school closures that we previously had in our title. Also good to mention that what we are presenting here is joint work with Rolf van der Velde, Bas Aerts, Henry Abik, Madelon Jacobs, and also Sanne van Wetten. So we have a big team of authors and analysts on this project. And it is actually part of the project, the Netherlands Cohort Study and Education, which in Dutch is Nationaal Cohortonderzoek Onderwijs, as you see at the logo. And that's the project through which the data are collected that we have analyzed for this paper. Okay, maybe before I start, feel free to put questions in the chat. Tom, feel free to interrupt me if you think it is useful to ask a question now. Of course, we will also make sure to leave enough time later to answer questions and discuss things. Let's start with the introduction. Well, after everything we've heard this afternoon, I don't think much of what is on this slide is actually new to you. A lot of these things have been mentioned already. I wish I was able to say that we have had a crisis and we are analyzing the effects, but unfortunately we're still, well, maybe not in the middle of it, but definitely still in it. And that has consequences for education as well. There were several studies, and actually the second session of the afternoon, the international session, gave a good overview of what has been done in analyzing effects of school closures and interrupted education all over the world, actually. And to just quickly sum that up, the research that was discussed there as well shows detrimental consequences on the learning gains of students of these school closures, and especially the school closures that happened very sudden in spring of 2020. In the Netherlands, it was the case, no one saw it coming. It happened over a weekend. All of a sudden, the schools had to close, and that, well, it created a lot of chaos, to say the least. And the project I just mentioned, the NCO, is a Dutch abbreviation. We made some fact sheets on the first school closure in the Netherlands, and then we did show quite large learning loss, or a decline in learning gains for reading, for spelling, and for mathematics, and the largest learning loss was for reading. What is maybe even more important is that we really showed large inequalities between different types of students and schools, and especially the students who were already disadvantaged in their background, socioeconomic status, family situation, were hit the hardest by the crisis. But that's not what this presentation is about, because although we know quite some things about this first period of school closure and the first period of the effects on education of the COVID-19 crisis, we're now more than a year in, and not so much is known yet, at least by research, about the impact of the second school closure or the whole year of COVID-19 crisis in education. As far as we know, but please, if you are aware of other research that has been done about that, let us know. But as far as we know, there is one report about the UK from Blaney and Henny, and they look at this whole year and show substantial drops in attainment. And actually, more than twice the drops they showed after the first half a year. And I'm already going to give a small peek preview at our results. This is not what we see in the study we're presenting here. Well, what were the questions that we asked? Well, first of all, to what extent does one full year of crisis affect the learning gains and losses of primary school students? And again, looking at the inequality, the potential inequality in the effect. To what extent do these results differ between students? And it's not in this paper, but Lynn will say a little bit about it. We also analyzed this for different types of schools. We decided to make a separate paper of that. but we'll give a small peek preview on the results on differences between schools as well in this presentation. The research setting, well, you probably already guessed by what I've been saying so far, it's about Dutch primary education. We look at students from grades 1 to grade 6, basically age 6 to 12. And what's a unique feature of the Dutch system and what we're using in this paper, in this research, is that Dutch primary school students take a standardized test twice a year. Once a midterm test in usually January, February, and an end of term test at the end of the year, May or June. And this unique feature of Dutch primary education, all schools are obliged to have their children take these tests. So this is what we can use to get an idea about the effects on learning gains of students. And well, I'm just quickly going to show you these timelines, but I'm not going to spend much time on it because I think by now it's, well, you've heard this many times. But if there's a midterm test in January, February, that means that right before the crisis hit the world, a test was taken. There was one at the end of last academic year, although in the Netherlands, some schools postponed that till right after summer. So that's, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but that's the end test here that was actually not taken before the summer break, but afterwards. And then this school year, there was supposed to be a test again in January, February, but that was well, coinciding with when the second school closure in the Netherlands happened. So actually this midterm test that was most recently taken was administered mostly in end of February and in March at primary schools. So although the pandemic even influenced when the tests were taken that are usually have quite a stable schedule, they were still taken and we can use them to analyze effects. And let me also say that although we have this test in between the end tests of the academic last year, in this presentation, we mostly focus on the effects of one full year of COVID, because we already presented the work on the first semester, the first part, quite a lot. Some information on the data. We have data from the student standardized test administration system from 2013 on, up until the most recent midterm test. And that's for the data that we include in this paper, because although we can look back quite a couple of years, which is very useful to look at the trends of developments in learning gains, which are relatively stable, except of course for this year. In our analysis, we focus on the latest 3 years, so the 2 years before the COVID crisis hit and the most recent year of learning development, which means we have almost 500,000 pupil students in our data and 1,650 schools, which is roughly a quarter of all Dutch primary schools. So quite a nice coverage of the schools that we have in the country. Well, I already said we have grades 1 to 6, and we look at reading, spelling, and math. And for those of you who are Dutch, who know the system, these are only the tests that were taken by the test supplier CITO, although for the future, we'll probably extend that to other test suppliers as well. But that's only the test information. What makes our research also quite well, unique is a very extensive, good database on students and schools and background information on students and schools. So we can quite specifically define the socioeconomic status of students, their situation at home, whether they live with both parents or whether their parents are divorced, they live with just one parent, the number of siblings they have at home, migration background. So these detailed personal characteristics, they really allow us to look quite detailed into potential inequalities due to this crisis. Well, of course, we collected a lot of data, but not all of it was useful. We could only include students when they had both a midterm test, well, at one point, and then again a midterm test a year after. So we could actually look at the learning gain for students. Students had to be in the data in these last 3 years. We included, because we look at learning gain until the next year, only grades 1 to 5, because students in grade 5 1 year after are in grade 6, and afterwards they leave school, so we cannot include them anymore. And to reduce the potential effects of outliers, we excluded the top and bottom 1% and learning gains from the analysis for each of the three domains: reading, spelling, and math. Well, just quickly before I give the floor to Lynn, who will discuss the results, the identification strategy. Forget about the equations, that's not too important, but we look at the learning gain as the outcome variable, which we actually standardize. So we standardize the COVID year learning gain in relation to the learning gain of the 2 years before that. So we assume by doing that, that the learning gain would be relatively more or less the same if the crisis had not happened. And to look at the impact of student background variables, we use interaction terms. So we look at the year of the crisis and interact that with certain background characteristics of students and see how this combined indicator, combined term of both treatment and background characteristics influences the learning gain of those specific students. Let me give the floor to Lynn now.
Thank you, Carla. Now we return to the results. We look at the standardized differences in learning gain where we compare the year of COVID-19 with the previous years. Here we see in the treatment variable the treatment variable shows that there is a learning loss of 70 standard deviations for reading, 0.07 for spelling, and 14 for math. If we then think of a school year that exists of 40 weeks, then this means that there is a learning loss of 7 weeks for reading, and 3 weeks for spelling, and 6 weeks for math. And if we then also take into account that the school closures were about 11 weeks, so 6 weeks for the first school closure and 5 weeks for the second closure, then this means that during these weeks, the learning rate of these students was about 65%. Then we now continue to the analysis of the background characteristics of students. We start with the socioeconomic status of students. Here we see that, well, first we expected that children from high socioeconomic status families were more likely to experience a lower learning loss because their parents have more resources. For instance, they can help their children with homework when they are higher educated, and they have also probably more knowledge about the education system, but they have also more financial resources, such as they can provide each child with a laptop, and the children don't have to sit in one room, and they all have different calls with their teachers, and things like that, high parents are probably more able to do than lower CES parents. And what we see here is that the constant resembles the effect of the low socioeconomic status children before the COVID-19 year, and the treatment effect explains the difference between the years before COVID-19 and the years after for the lower socioeconomic status children. So what we see here is that there is a learning loss of approximately 7.70 standard deviations for reading, 0.20 for math, and 0.11 for spelling. And we can also compare this with the learning losses of the medium and high socioeconomic status, which we will do in the next figure. And here we see that the theoretical arguments that we thought about before are in line with what we see in this research, because here we see that the high socioeconomic status children have a smaller learning loss than the medium and lower socioeconomic status children. And we see this for math, spelling, and reading. And then we continue with the household structure. Here we expected that the one-parent households, children living in one-parent households were having a larger learning loss because their parents have less time to spend are less able to spend time to them, and therefore are probably also less likely to help them with their homework, or not as much as in households with two parents. And this is also what we found for all the three domains. And then we continue to the family size. Family size is measured in our analysis with a large family is a family existing of 3 children or more living in the household. And we were thinking about this relationship, and this could be twofold. On the one hand, we could think that a larger family could mean more helpers in the family. So if there is an older brother or sister, they can help the younger children. But on the other hand, a larger family could also increase the learning loss because there's more distraction. Perhaps they even have to share their laptops. And that's also what we found in this research. So what we found is in line with the last argument. So for math spelling, we find that large families of children living in large families have larger learning loss than children living in smaller families. And for reading, we don't see this because the differences are not significant. And then we continue with gender. Generally, girls are better in language, and boys are better in math. And there is also some inequalities between the girls and boys. And what we see here in our analysis is that the inequalities it seems to be that they became smaller because the learning loss for boys is larger in math, while for girls it's larger for spelling. And again, for reading, we didn't find any significant differences. And then, as Carla already told you, I have some preliminary results for the school differences. So we also looked at the different school types in an other paper, and what we found there is that the learning losses are the largest for schools with a higher share of low socioeconomic status students. It's also larger for smaller schools, so schools with less than 140 students. So if you divide that on the 6 grades that are available in the Netherlands, that means that the schools are relatively small. And then also schools located in non-urban areas have a larger learning loss. And then we also did some robustness check to be sure that our conclusions remain the same. So we did an inverse probability weight to account for the selectivity and overrepresentation, because we saw that some populations and schools were overrepresented, and we corrected for these. Then we also included additional student and school level background characteristics, also some school fixed effects. We also did some multi-level models, some placebo analysis, and we also created some trend figures of the development of the learning gains. So to conclude, in this paper, we looked at the learning gate after 1 full year of COVID-19 crisis, and we found that there was a learning loss. This learning loss differs across the 3 domains, and if we recalculated that to the number of weeks, we see that the learning loss is 7 weeks for reading, 6 weeks for math, and 3 weeks for spelling. We also saw that the inequalities between students were increased, except for gender, because there it looked like that they became smaller. And if we compare it to the first school closure, we see that the overall learning losses are decreased, but the inequality between students and schools has remained equally high. And we also find that for some indicators, it was even increased. So to conclude, although distance learning is better than no schooling at all, it cannot compensate the classroom teaching. And this was our presentation. Are there any questions?